Hey, this is Connor with Biker's Edge, and today we have the ultimate long travel trail bike showdown between the giant Trance X and the Orbea Occam. Whoa, that's a corner. Oh man, short dropper just smashed my nuts. Oh. So never in the history of bikes have two bikes been more similar than these two. They're very, very close. You can almost call them identical. They both live in that long travel trail bike that climbs way better than it should while being a very well-rounded descender. Their geometry, build components, all the specs are very, very similar. So what sets them apart? I recently spent a lot of time on the giant Trance X for our review. Card will show up in one of these. I think it's this one. I recently spent a lot of time on that bike for our review, but it had been quite a while since I had ridden the Orbea Occam. So I wanted to throw a leg over one, do a lot of back-to-back testing. So I've been down here in St. George, Utah for most of a week now riding these bikes. So let's dive in. We're going to cut to the ride impressions right now. All right, I am back in the desert again. It's that time of year. This time I am on the giant Trance X 29. Recently reviewed this bike. It is an awesome kind of well-rounded all-purpose trail bike. So really quick background on this bike. It is a 135 millimeter travel trail bike with 150 millimeter fork. Pretty long, stretched out. In the low mode, which I have it in right now because that's closer to what the Occam is, it's 65.5 degrees. It's got a Fox 36 on the front, so kind of bigger, burlier fork with the Fox DPX2 on the rear. So while it rides and feels like a trail bike, you know, it's got a little burlier suspension to help when things get really rough. Both the Trance and the Occam kind of fall into that bikes that climb way better than they should category. You know, on paper they look a little bigger. You would think all mountain bike really when you look at these. But they climb a lot more like a trail bike. I'd say they're closer to like how the Tallboy and Ripley climb than say like the High Tower and Ripmo. Here we go, we are in it now. It's kind of super technical, but just doable without too much fuss. It's really fun. And like I said, this bike just crushes technical climbs. So compared to the Occam on the climbs, I do think this bike is a little bit less efficient, but it's a little more active. So when you get into the really techie, bumpy stuff, that rear wheel doesn't get hung up or bounce. And I think it just gives you a little more traction. All right, things get just a little bit spicy up here, a little difficult. Oh boy, I bobbled that. All right, yeah, not too bad. That's a pretty rough transition at the bottom. Oh, slid out. I gotta focus here and not talk. Sorry. And for how well this bike climbs, it descends fairly aggressively. It's not an all mountain bike. It rides more like a trail bike with a little extra travel for when you need it. You know how I said it climbs more like the Ripley Tallboy. I wouldn't quite say it descends just like those bikes, but I think it descends closer to those than it does like the Ripmo and Hightower and SB 130. So this bike actually handles bumpy, chunky terrain very well. So when things get steep, that forward weight posture comes back to bite you just a little bit. You know, it's awesome for the climbs, traverses, but on the descents, your weight's fairly far forward. And when things get really steep, it's further forward than you'd like it to be. It's not a deal breaker by any means, but if you ride a ton of really steep terrain, I would maybe look at some other options. If you ride terrain that's like gnarly but just not overly steep, this bike is awesome. The suspension just handles those bumps so well. It's fast. It's got a pretty good firm supportive suspension platform for jumping, for cornering hard. While it's big, it really doesn't feel that unmanageable. Tight switchbacks, tight corners, kind of this twisty desert terrain actually is just fine. You've got your weight up over the front where you've got good control of the handlebars and front wheel. So I think that's why it's not very unwieldy or huge. But it does start to handle pretty well when you're going fast in a big straight line like this. It gets stable and you're not worried about twitchy steering or the front end tucking under you. It just feels pretty good. The build kit on this bike, I don't really have any problems with. I think the components are all right in line with where they should be. There's nothing weird that jumps out. You get a GX drivetrain, solid, reliable, it works. You get Performance Elite suspension, at least on the front, so you get a lot of adjustability. You get a Performance DPX2, works really well. You get carbon wheels on a $5,500 bike, so can't complain there. My biggest complaint is the dropper post. It's too short, so I don't love that. The more I ride this bike, the more impressed I get with it, with how well-rounded and balanced it is. For how well it climbs, it goes downhill super well. And it just doesn't really have a preference one way or the other. It sits in the middle between uphill and downhill. And a lot of bikes that do that just end up being a little bland and a little boring. But this one's anything but that. It's a lively, fun, energetic climber and just a pretty engaging downhill ride. It's not ultra plush monster truck gooey, but it's not squirrely and scary. It just strikes such a great balance. So now it's time to go grab the Occam and do another one of these laps. Got another 6 or so miles to do, and then we'll go talk about both bikes. All right, I'm back for a second lap on the Orbea Occam this time. Quick background on the Occam. It is a 140 mil travel bike, front and rear normally, but you can upgrade to a 150 mil Fox 36 instead of the 140 millimeter Fox 34, and that's what I'm on today, is the upgraded longer travel, stiffer, bigger chassis fork. Normally it's about a 66 degree head tube and 77 on the seat tube, but with that longer fork, you know, you add 10 millimeters of axle to crown height, and it slacks it out by about a half degree. I ran it through a couple of bike geometry calculators. It comes out at about 65.6 or 65.5 on the head tube.
you know, your seat tube's going to get a half degree slacker as well. Your reach shrinks just a little bit, and the front end of the bike, your stack gets a little bit taller, but not by much. So this bike, like the Trance, kind of climbs better than it should, or it just feels more trail bikey and less all mountain than the numbers and geo and everything suggest. But yeah, this bike climbs really well. It's very efficient, very quick. I don't think it's quite got the traction that the Trance has, and once we get into some of this technical climbing, we'll see how it does there. For me, that Trance X is one of the better technical climbers I've ever ridden. I can't exactly put my finger on why. I think a lot of it's the geometry, but I can clean things on that bike that I struggle with on other bikes. So we'll see when we get to those bits on this bike. All right, we're getting into the techie stuff here, so it'll be cool to see how this bike compares to the Trance, which I feel is just one of the better technical climbers out there. That actually went pretty good. This bike doesn't have as active of a rear end, but it's a little smaller, makes it a little easier to kind of pick and wind your way through these rocks. And it's just ultra efficient, so not wasting a ton of energy bouncing around on all these rocks. All right, now we're coming up to that techie little roll again. Let's see here. Oh man, short dropper just smashed my nuts. Oh, I did not like short dropper posts. And I struggled there a little bit, just lost my balance. Oh, just punched that rock. Struggling here just a little bit on some of this technical stuff. All right, so the Occam is a good climber. I think it's more efficient than the Trance. I think when it gets into technical bits though, the slightly more active suspension platform on the Trance is an advantage. I think it climbs technical stuff just a little bit better. Downhill here. Whoa, that's a corner. You'd think I wouldn't miss that corner because I just rode this trail, but I'm really good at bikes, I guess, huh? This bike is a little less stable and planted than the Trance. Trance has longer wheelbase, and I think it just has a bigger, more stable feel to it. This is a little more engaging, a little more lively. Turns just a little bit quicker, but I'm not pushing the pace quite as much through some of this technical stuff as I was on the Trance. But I think I'm jumping more stuff, so that's pretty fun. This bike feels like it handles just a little bit quicker. The getting around a corner, it's a little faster, but there's a little less traction. So I'm a little more hesitant in the corners, but I think it is easier to get around a corner, especially some of these tighter ones. But yeah, I think the handling is just a little bit quicker than on the Trance. Okay. Got a bit of a high speed section here. I really like this bit. You can end up going pretty fast. This bike definitely does not feel as planted and stable at this high speed as the Trance did. This one's bouncing around just a little bit more. And again, I feel like the back wheel on this bike hangs up just a little bit more in all this chattery, rocky stuff. So I think if you're riding, you know, smooth stuff more often and it's not as bumpy, this bike's going to be a more engaging and rewarding ride, I think. Jumping's fun, cornering's fun, just moving the bike around is a little bit easier. As far as components go on this bike, you do get really good build for your, I think it's $5,800, no, $5,580. So really not too different than the Trance. This one comes with factory suspension front and back, so that's nice, you get a lot of value there. This does have aluminum wheels instead of carbon, but they are good aluminum wheels. Good, reliable DT 1600s. Pretty solid, pretty strong. They have a really nice ride quality. Again, same complaint as on the Trance. Dropper post is just too short. So closing thoughts on this bike. I think it's a super fun, engaging, rewarding ride, and I'll stand by my original review that it really shines on smoother, faster trails and less so on chunky trails. So it kind of depends on how you ride. If you like smooth, fast stuff, like, tough to find a better bike than this. If you like chunky stuff, I think there are others. I mean, even that Trance is a little more composed in the chunky terrain. So, really cool bike. I'm gonna get back, put all my thoughts down. We're gonna go over how these two compare.
So, like, final answer, let's get down to the nitty gritty. Who should buy each bike? If you ride rocky terrain, bumpy terrain, but you want a bike that goes uphill as well as it goes downhill, and you just want to be able to ride it everywhere, you know, from a cruiser green trail to a double black diamond, and you don't ever want to feel like you've got the wrong bike, I don't think you can go wrong here. The Trance X covers a huge variety of trails and difficulty. It just is a very well-rounded, very good bike. It just disappears underneath you. You don't even pay attention to the bike. You just pay attention to the trail and riding and what you can do as a rider. And it's not like, oh, bike's doing this, bike's doing that, bike's holding me back here. You just don't even think about the bike when you're riding it. And if you ask me, that's like the gold standard. Alternatively, if you ride flow trails a lot, so fast, flowy, smooth, buffed out single track, and you want a bike that just is a full-on rocket uphill, that just is, again, very well-rounded, uphill, downhill, just doesn't really have a preference, I think you go with the Occam. It's more lively, more engaging, and a little bit more fun, especially on smooth trails. And that's not to say it won't handle rocks. It handles rocks just fine, but I think it requires you to bring your A game. All right, just wrapping up the Occam versus the Trance video here. Just one last time to reiterate, a little more aggressive, a little more grounded, a little bit more lively, and a little more responsive. But I mean, difference is very, very little. It took me a week's worth of riding to really kind of come to that conclusion. If you think I got it wrong, I don't really believe you, because I've probably spent more time on both of these bikes than you have. But I guess if you want, leave a comment below. If you want to demo either one of these bikes so you can have firsthand experience of this little showdown, make sure to visit Biker's Edge. We've got a huge demo fleet. I'll leave a link in the description below for a hookup on a demo bike even, you know, just for you, YouTube. But yeah, thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next time.